All right, Teddy Race here. This is the First World War. This was an incredibly pleasant surprise. Whoever recommended this to me, and I don't remember who it is, and some of it may be reading some of the comments, etc., looking at some of the other reviews. I really want to thank them. This is one of my best finds really recently in terms of like, wow, I really like this from just one play. And obviously from just one play, I can't tell you everything about it. So there's some questions about, hey, how balanced is it? Well, in this one kind of uninformed play, it felt pretty damn closely balanced. It felt like both sides had a chance of instigating collapse throughout the course of the game. Very, very light, clean system, okay? Doesn't go into, it doesn't feel like a war game in terms of the kinds of decisions. You're not, picking your hexes, etc. And kind of feels more like some of the very channeled point-to-point games, which I tend to actually like. Things like the Mr. Madison's War, where you really kind of don't have a lot of choices of where you're going. You're attacking from one space to another. But instead of going with the point-to-point, it abstracts it further. It says, you're just on this front, and the points you reach are the points you reach. We don't actually have to represent the units in it and deal with movement or anything of that nature. You're just on a series of tracks that are how far you've gone in a particular front. And I think that works just fine. Kind of reminds me a little of Tito in terms of like, hey, you're just in this general area fighting, but there are key locations that are important, although with a little bit more abstraction because the locations are really just pretty much a track. For all that, the kind of decision making you're in it, there's a lot of luck in the game. There's no question of that. This is not the game for the person who expects to always see the best player win. There are trade-offs in terms of managing that luck. There are times when you could be losing the game very, very clearly and be able to take a stab that'll give you one little chance of victory. And if your opponent doesn't try to prevent that, you're in a position where you could win on the luck of a die roll. If your opponent does try to prevent that, they may be giving up much of their opportunity to gain advantages on you. So there's some really interesting facets in terms of like how much risk you're willing to accept, what costs you're willing to pay to mitigate those risks. A lot of stuff like that that I really, really like in the game. As a game. It also happens to represent World War I very nicely, because even by 1915, now it's possible you could have a collapse in 1914, and that's the Schlieffen Plan, right? But even by 1915, you're seeing the countries at times coming to these teetering points where it looked like they might have collapsed, and the chances are low. Historically, it didn't happen. Historically, national will was able to be resurrected again and again until you hit 1917, where things really start getting problematic. So, broadly based, the history of the game still, I think, works very, very nicely. It's this kind of hidden placement bluffing type game, but with enough luck in there that you're not just playing a rock, paper, scissors, or some kind of. There's a number of games that kind of feel like you're placing your resources and that just determines everything. This isn't that. This has enough luck in it in terms of the combat that those bluffs are bluffs that are being taken into account with, or those choices are choices that are being taken into account, not just with the idea of bluffing your opponent and maybe being able to trick him and get an advantage that you wouldn't think you'd get otherwise, but ones that are firmly based in this risk assessment process. All right, well, let's talk about the components. The first one is the rulebook is pretty damn poor. For a game that's this simple in concept, it goes through a lot of words and a lot of pictures, and it's hard to find what you need in it. This could be a 2-page war game rule book that was very, very clearly understood and explained. Because it's phalanx, they needed a lot more words and pictures in it, and I don't think that format is the best way to represent the situation. Someone who's not used to playing war games might find that there are some concepts that they just don't get in it. Not that this is very wargamey, but it's not as well explained as it should be for what it presents, and also you're going to have trouble finding things in a reference. Some of the aspects are also not well explained that should be. So, for example, the little combat counters, well, the only way to really figure out what you've got is to look in this chart, and this chart doesn't directly give you a mapping. You don't have like a number on here or something that tells you what you got. You got to kind of guess what you have. If it's a person, you look for a person who fits. There may be a consistent grammar on these counters, but that's not explained, so you're going to have to either figure that out for yourself or just absorb it through multiple plays. I found that the chart was what I needed, but it was more work and more effort. And I have to say, overall, the rules presented more work and more effort than there should be for such a simple game. The map representation, okay. It's not pretty. I'll tell you that much. For a phalanx game, the map doesn't end up very appealing in looks. Usually their games are very, very graphically appealing. It's a good component, though. I'm going to say one thing that I think is missing historically in terms of giving a historical accuracy to the game. There's no terrain in the game, and that causes some issues because major efforts can be made in areas that probably were not really open for major assaults to be made successfully. So, for example, down here, you can take Mulhausen. It's as easy to take Mulhausen as it is to take Antwerp. You know? There's something wrong about that. The Italian front is just as easy to advance on as is the Russian front, and there's a lot more Russian front. That's probably the biggest thing that I see as a historical flaw to the game, and where I could see the game ending up being played by people who've played it a few times, where they start concentrating on fronts that are easier to win on than they could possibly have actually been. There's some complexity to trying to add terrain to the game, though, and I'm not absolutely certain that the kind of fixes that come to my mind, like a +1 defensive bonus to the original owner of the space when attacked, that seems like it would be a viable thing in certain locations, and would just be a simple addition to the rules. It wouldn't really increase the complexity very much to the game. The problem with that is the army strengths are all the same for the different nationalities, and so like the Germans are going to be able to plow through the Alps pretty well anyway, even with that +1. And you probably wouldn't see the Italian offensives and stuff like that at all, which actually did happen. Although, how much did they take away from the Western Allies fighting in France? I don't know. You know, those Italian offenses, I almost feel like there should be a third player to take that on. The game relies on this concept of each faction, and there's 4 in the game, gets to do one operation in each season, basically. You have four turns per, 4 segments that you're going to get to operate your faction in each overall game turn, which is a year long, except for in 1914, where time is compressed as it often is in World War I games, because the war changes significantly between 1914 and 1915, and pretty much it's happening in the winter of 1914. So you have a much more fluid situation in 1914, and that's represented by giving more terms there than any other than any other equivalent portion of time has. You basically have 2 full game terms covering late 1914, and then from the rest of the war, it's 1 game term per year. The game has a fixed endpoint. That's another historical iffiness to me. It will only go to 1918. Now, there's a reason for that. The war was about to change, and was beginning to change significantly at the very end of 1918. The 100 Days Offensive and everything. It was becoming mobile again, and you would need to start creating much more active turns to change that historical result. So by putting the fixed endpoint where the war actually did end into play there and creating victory points there, I think you create something that's historically less believable, but even if it matches historical reality, but it's historically less believable in the way it's scripted to end there. But you would have to change the game significantly in order to fix that. So you get the replacement points, you get your full army's replacement points in 1914 turn 2. I don't mind that too much. There was a greater effort to flow troops in there than there ever could be later in the war, along with the mobilization efforts that are going on. So that's not too bad. But if you wanted to make the game mobile again after 1918, if you said, okay, let's go to 1918, let's make 1918 2 turns, and then make 1919 on, say, 3 or 4 full game turns per year, you could do that. But you would have to say, you know what, there is not going to be the same replacement rate. And then you'd probably have to bring more counters in for the US, etc. Wow. We've kind of diverged from where I wanted to go, which was counters. I already talked about the rest of the components. I've already talked about these guys. They're kind of unreadable. They serve their function very nicely. You have some one-use ones that are penalties, but most of them, they represent the technology. They represent the surprises that take place in a combat, and you're forced to use them. So it's kind of interesting that way. At least that's my reading of the rules. It may not be. I may not be reading that correctly. Let's see, what else? The actual player counters, the actual army piece counters. You've got real pieces and you've got dummies. They're all, this is phalanx quality pieces. They're just fantastic. You don't have to trim them. You don't have to do anything. You might have to trim a couple of pieces that popped out a little bit of tear off the counter sheet. And of course, if you're not careful, you might damage your own counters. That's just punching counters, right? The one thing that I kind of am not sure I like is that the units are all very uniform. Okay. That's not a problem the way the game is. The only reason it would be a problem is with the terrain rules in place. I feel like there would be some necessity. There should be some value to adding maybe some specialized units that maybe can ignore a terrain bonus or something like that. And you start to get to more complexity. And that's why I'm afraid of making that modification to the game, because it is clean and works very nicely on its own. But it does look like it's going to create some ahistorical situations. I tried to play fairly historically. I played with the historical modifications at the beginning of the game. They worked fine in directing the game in a certain way. Normally you get to set up it however you like, so you get to create your own war plan at the beginning of the war. That probably favors the Central Powers because they can start beating on the Russians real early, and that's always a good move. That's an option in some other games too. But this forces you to supposedly follow the Schlieffen plan. Not really. It forces you to make an assault in the west on the first turn if you want to as the Axis. One thing that I like is that organically the game, I forgot components again, the dice. I'll get to them in a moment. Organically, the game kind of presents you with the reasons for the grand offensives, and the old SPI World War I does this too, but a lot of games have to bake these in because the attritional nature of World War I makes it so that, I don't actually want to do an offensive. Well, in this game, actually, you do want to do them, and you want to do them naturally from the way the game outgrows. Your replacement rate is such that you can look at it and say, you know what, I want to bleed my opponent dry. And the way I do that is that I make him take losses that he won't replace up to my replacement point. And at that point, then you can decide different things. You're faced with these hard decisions, though, because you only get 4 actions per turn, or per year, and per faction. And one of those actions is to attack, which is what you generally want to do. You're like, oh, I have an attack on this front that I want to do something with, and I have a chance of getting that surrender point. I have a chance of getting a better victory, a potential to win the game on this turn. So you've always are kind of chasing that dream, right? And it's not really a dream. It can happen in this game. You're not in a situation where you're just looking at, geez, I'm chasing this dream and killing off troops, and it's for no purpose at all, and what the hell, I'm just playing an attritional war. No, you're actually trying to knock the enemy out, and that's something that Le Grand Guerre handles beautifully, but it never actually happens because it's too hard to do, or at least it doesn't happen early in the war. You think you've got a shot at it, but you really don't. Well, in this, you've got a real shot. If you can push hard enough to get to a certain point, you can get a 1 in 6 chance of winning the game without maybe without looking like you're winning too heavily on the board, and without it having any effect on the later turns, to tell you the truth. Okay, so going to and I like that. It gives you that illusion of glory type thing, right? That you're able to pursue again and again. I think this captures it maybe as well as anything other than Le Grand Guerre. Le Grand Guerre makes you drive for it even though it's really unlikely. Here it's a little more, it's maybe a little too likely. The game's got a lot of randomness in it. Okay, the dice. I generally don't like wooden dice. This has wooden dice. They don't tend to be terribly well balanced, such as life. But you need to actually use these because, or pretend 5s and 6s have S's written on them, because it does have special values on it. And those S's don't make you surrender, but they count as zeros when you're fighting. And they also generate your chit draws. And it's just a neat little piece to the game. The chit draws, you tend to want those. They're usually to your advantage, but you don't have much choice in how you use them. You can say, okay, I've got a chit in my hand. I had better attack here. You're also constantly making these decisions of, oh my God, the enemy's just blown my front wide open. I can't do the offensive I want to continue doing. I can't pursue it as hard. I have to call it off, or at least delay it, and pull some troops from somewhere else. And pulling those troops from somewhere else probably breaks your offensive, in order to prevent the enemy from getting too big a gain in an area. Just, it may be a little too volatile, a little too bloody. Well, not bloody, but a little too likely for a whole front to collapse easily. But you do have that opportunity each time to bring more troops in and to reinforce that front and make sure that it doesn't collapse completely. So with a little bit of abstraction, acceptance, a little bit of hand-waving, you can very easily look at this and say, yeah, it works pretty well. I honestly like it. I think it does a better representation of World War I than almost anything that I've seen. The only competition that I can really put up for it, I'm not sure about the lamps are going out. That I've played, out of the games that I've played. That one I've played, and I saw no flaws in how it represented things. But I haven't played it very much, and there's enough going on, enough complexity that I can say, I could see that this is going to break down, and I just can't say anything certain about it. For this one, I don't think that I can see much breaking down more than I've already expressed. It's a very simple system. It's easy to comprehend what's going on, what could go on, even though the decisions are not trivial in any sense of the word. Notably, all the more complex games that I've seen on World War I, the subsystems, in some way or another, create a historical result when combined. So you take the very, very detailed and attempt to be accurate in La Grande Guerre or in Balance of Powers, and wow, when they mix together, they create an attritional combat system that that destroys, at least under the kind of play that I play, that destroys the possibility of regenerating your army at the rate that you want to. Because it's always to your advantage, it's always to someone's advantage to attack in a certain theater. It's always to their advantage. The Central Powers, they want to probably, the way I play, they probably want to destroy the Russian army and try to topple Russia. And because you're bleeding, you're taking some losses while you fight in Russia, the Western Allies want to attrition the Germans down. And that's a perfectly natural and historical result, but what ends up happening is the armies bleed too hard. They don't bleed too hard here. The regeneration rate fits my style of play, which I think is actually fairly historical, which is to hit hard and again and again and again. And at least the regenerations that I saw for the first couple of years were happening. The Russians were actually pushed to a point where they could not rebuild their entire army, but they're getting more reinforcements in. So, their mobilization is still not fully utilized. It's just they don't have the full resources to mobilize that huge force, and it makes sense perfectly fine to me. There's a lot that's not directly represented in this. This is just the land war. It's not worried about the naval situation. It's not worried about the blockade. It's all kind of stuff that it's just not, it's just not putting any details into. But it's handled abstractly by the reinforcement chart, by the number of replacement points you get. You just don't get to play in those spheres. You don't get to play in the Near East. It's the main event, and it's the main event cut in a streamlined version that actually really seems to almost work. But only almost. There are a couple little nitpickings, like the terrain situation, that I think are going to create very ahistorical situations. One thing that I noticed is, and I don't know if this is something that Ted Racier feels deeply inside him, but the Italian front is once again appears to be too important. He does the same thing in Paths of Glory. He makes the Italian front very important in that. In this one, it's even maybe more important because the whole Western Alliance can surrender due to victories in Italy, and that is hard to accept or believe. Similarly, the Russians can be forced to surrender through victories in the Balkans. Again, hard to believe. These things, they have to be that way because there's only 4 factions operating. If the Austrians make an offensive in the Balkans to try to win the point there, and historically they did fight in the Balkans pretty hard, then they have to, you have to give them something worthwhile in the game to make them pursue that. Likewise, there was fighting along the Italian front. You have to give them something, you have to give the players something worthwhile to go chase that. But because of the shortness of the tracks in Italy and in the Balkans early in the war, you can win the game off of knocking Italy out. You not only do the Western Allies surrender, but everybody surrenders. You've just won the game if you force one of the factions to surrender. And I feel like that doesn't work quite right. I didn't get to see the Brest-Litovsk Treaty come about. Here's my problem with it. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty is about as well as the Central Powers could have expected in terms of any kind of victory from Russia. In fact, it's probably better than they would have gotten with it from an early victory in Russia in terms of the amount of land that they just conquered and was signed away. Yet that is not considered a big enough victory to end the game, and it didn't end the war. Which is to say, if you knocked Russia out of the war for real, I do not believe the war ends. If you knock France out, yeah, I think it does. Certainly if you knock the whole Western Alliance out, yeah, it does, and that's how it's represented here. Of course, you can do that by invading Italy successfully. I don't know about that. But yeah, you can make this, relatively minor victory over Serbia that in any reasonable historical view of the war shouldn't knock Russia out, and certainly wouldn't end the whole war either, but neither of those cases is believable. And it can do both those things. So, again, there are some factors of this that keep it, I think, from ever being really a historically accurate depiction, but in some other ways, it's doing a better job than almost any other game that I've seen. Going back to components, I don't know what the hell to do with it. It's totally does not fit this game. It just doesn't give you anything. It's got these card slots. What am I going to put there? It's got nothing to organize the counters in. I mean, I guess I can put them in these things, but they don't really make sense in that. I don't know what these are for putting coins in or something. I don't know. It's got room for 6 dice, maybe 7 dice. I don't know. It's just like this generic insert that absolutely does you no good. It's coming out. I'm going to keep it kicking around because I can never throw anything out completely. It might serve me some purpose, but I highly doubt it. Yeah. Very, very pleasant surprise. I mean, it does the job, I think, a lot better than most World War I games do. It doesn't give you the level of detail that I want when I'm sitting down to play a serious war game. Serious wargaming. But for something that's going to give me kind of a beer and pretzels feel with potentially some really interesting risk analysis decisions to make. The luck's enough that the risk analysis doesn't guarantee me anything. It is risk analysis after all. But if I don't trust my luck, if I don't trust my chance to get through the turn without rolling a 1 at the end of the turn, there are things I can do to mitigate that risk. They cost me. And I've got to decide, is that cost worse than that 1 in 6 chance of just losing the game outright at the end of the turn? Or whatever. There might be multiple 1 in 6 chances eventually. It's quick enough that, in a normal gaming day, you can say, well, screw it, let's play it again. Let's switch sides and play it again, see if something different comes up. Or, luck screwed me, let's do it again and see if my plan works better, under different, under different tests. Can I do better playing this way? Of course, your opponent may change their strategy based on having seen how you want to play. But yeah, I think this is a little gem. I really do. I am very impressed with it for what it is. No game's perfect. This one obviously is not perfect historically, but and that's an important factor to me. But I think it's as good as most of the others out there. And that's not hard to do when you abstract things. But I find this much, much more both enjoyable and historically accurate than, say, an Axis and Allies type game, which is also more complex. in its own ways, but I mean, if you've ever seen how Axis and Allies, the original, I haven't played any of the spawnings from it, but if you've seen how the naval war goes in that in the Pacific, you're like, well, this isn't at all believable. This one, the intuitive moves that I made came up with a more believable game of World War I than Paths of Glory creates, okay? And that's Paths of Glory with the historical options, because Paths of Glory, first of all, the only way you can get Paths of Glory right is if you absolutely know the deck. You know what the future's going to be, right? You know what these random things that are coming are going to be, and you plan for them, which is ahistorical in and of itself. Here you don't have that. Here the randomness factor is really random enough that you don't know what the hell is going to happen. All you can do is make best guesses. You can look at the probabilities, the odds, and, then you make your decision. Which way do you want to go? Yeah. Are you losing the game? Do you need to take riskier choices? You got that option, and you might win the game by doing so. You might win the game like that by doing so. You might be able to win that last chance, the Kaiserschlag type attempt to knock France out of the war. Everything here really feels good to me. Now, this is on one play. I want to play this again, though. I want to play this again in a way that most games don't make me want to play it again. The last game that I think made me feel that way was another World War I-ish game, Europe in Turmoil. However, with that, I don't know how likely I'm to find an opponent. Here, I think I can convince my wife to play this, and I suspect she'll enjoy it. I know that I could bring this, and play this down at the game store with someone, maybe with 4 people in total. There is a difference in play between the 2-player and 4-player game. And the 3-player is kind of like a compromise between the two, because there are decisions that you will make in the terms of, well, do I want to be on the winning side but come in second? I think I can play this out and improve my chances of winning the overall war by doing things a little different. I also think that players' philosophy towards that whole situation can bring impact into it and can bring twists to it that I find kind of intriguing from a psychology sort of point of view, and I find that really interesting as well. How this game would play in different groups. Had less battery than I thought there. How people would see things, and how they value working together, and then coming in as the weaker partner in a victory. Whether or not they're willing to take that role, and how they judge that. Do I want to be on the losing side of the game, or do I want to come in as the weak partner in the winning side of the game? And that gives you a really, really interesting kind of determination. One that I think, because of how light this game is more likely to come up than a game like Whiff or a game like Third Reich or something like that, where honestly, I feel like all too often players are sitting there without the ability to make these big decisions that are going to win them the game over their allies in the war. They're much, much more likely to be trying to work together and cooperate. I think this opens things up a little bit more by making the victory so clear that you can say, well, we're doing pretty well here. I'm not going to go for the final push to try to win things because I'm the weaker person here out of my alliance. And instead, I'm going to try to pattern my nest a little bit and improve my chances of winning if we win. And thereby handing a chance maybe that wouldn't normally be there for the other side to win the game. Just because of a little bit of inter-alliance conflict. I don't think that emerges as well in the bigger, more complex games. Simply because it's not as obvious, and maybe to some extent the risk may seem too high of delaying or whatever. You feel like, especially as an Axis power, if you can win the game outright as Germany, yeah, well, if you're playing Third Reich and you win the game outright, as the Axis, but look, Italy's victory conditions say if they don't surrender, they basically win the most major victory possible, and Germany has to control so much stuff to get that same victory, and maybe I don't have that much. You get to a different kind of situation in terms of making your choices. I don't really remember those victory conditions very much, but yeah, I remember there being built-in considerations that led you to decision making that didn't make sense. Okay, it makes sense to me that Germany would want more of the pie than they have currently, and make sure that they are doing significantly better than the Austrians are in this game. In Third Reich, it may be, I have to delay the war and make sure Italy suffers and actually gets knocked out for me to win the bigger winner, something along those lines. And the thinking just doesn't fit. It's like, okay, we can score it afterwards, but it's meaningless. Here I feel like there is some meaning to the way that inter-alliance victory works. Now, there's clearly meaning to how the inter-alliance victory works in, say, Hitler's war, where it's more obvious, and in that Russian Western Allied viewpoint, you may, as the Western Allies, let the Russians suffer a little bit before you try to win the game, or something along those lines. Anyway, this was really impressive to me. Like I said, I definitely want to play it again. It ain't perfect. It does have its historical inconsistencies. It might be, with a little bit of tweaking, it could be very, very good. I don't know what little tweaks would be needed, what additional work could be done. Ted Reyes here has designed a lot more games than I have, infinitely many more. At least, that people actually play. I have to assume that he turned his mind to that problem and didn't see a solution to it, and said, this is a lot of fun, it's worth packaging out as it is. Now, there may have been some pushback to certain ideas. Like I said, it may be that, there is a terrain solution that would help the game a lot, but that the publisher Phalanx said, this is supposed to be a light game, and you're already pushing the borders of what we can do on that, what we're willing to publish. Take that out, you've still got a really fun, playable game that's not too far off the history. So deal with it, man. I don't know. I don't know whether or not. It would be really interesting to see. I'm interested in looking to see if anybody has any variants on this already out there, so that I don't have to, do the work to try to make them myself. Because I think this is actually worth tinkering around with to see if you can figure something out for it. Because it comes close. It really comes close. Anyway, damn good game.